Elisabeth of Austria was one of the most famous women in Europe. People travelled just to catch a glimpse of her. Her face appeared in paintings, poems, and later in films that turned her into a legend. And yet, the woman behind the legend spent most of her life deeply unhappy. She was known to the world as Sisi, and is often remembered as a romantic icon. Beautiful, mysterious, untouchable. But the truth is far less romantic. Elizabeth was born in 1837 into the Bavarian royal family, but from the beginning she occupied an odd position within it. Her family was royal, yes, but informal, almost careless by dynastic standards. Elizabeth grew up far from the suffocating ceremonial environments of Vienna or Paris. Her childhood was spent largely outdoors, riding horses, walking for hours through forests and mountains, and developing a deep attachment to nature. She was shy, introspective, and imaginative. She wrote poetry early in life and showed little interest in the social graces expected of a future consort. There was no rigorous preparation for court life, no grooming for political marriage, no emphasis on performance. Elizabeth was not raised to be useful, and that paradoxically made her vulnerable. When she was 15, her life was quietly redirected without her consent. Emperor Franz Joseph of Austria was meant to marry Elizabeth's older sister, Helene. The match had been planned carefully. Helene was considered suitable, disciplined, educated, and trained for the demands of imperial life. Elizabeth was not even part of the plan. But when Franz Joseph met both sisters, he ignored years of preparation and chose Elizabeth on the spot. History often paints this as a romantic gesture, love triumphing over duty. In reality, it was an impulsive decision made by a young emperor who could afford to be impulsive. Elizabeth could not. She was 15 years old. She barely spoke in formal settings. She'd never lived away from home. And suddenly, she was informed that she would become Empress of Austria. There was no real choice involved. Refusing was not an option. There was no gradual adjustment period, no allowance for her temperament or age. Within months, she was married, crowned, and transported to Vienna, where every aspect of her life would be regulated. This was not a fairy tale. It was miscasting on an imperial scale. Imagine selecting the least prepared, most freedom-loving person in a room and placing them in the most rigid role imaginable. Elizabeth wasn't inadequate, she was fundamentally incompatible with what was expected of her, and Vienna would make sure she understood that quickly. If Elizabeth's childhood had been defined by freedom, her marriage was defined by the sudden and total loss of it. The Austrian court was notoriously rigid, governed by layers of etiquette so dense that even experienced courtiers struggled to navigate them. Every movement was prescribed, every interaction was hierarchical. Even silence could be interpreted as a political statement. For Elizabeth, this environment was psychologically suffocating. But the most oppressive force in her new life was not the court itself. It was Archduchess Sophie, the emperor's mother. Sophie was intelligent, disciplined, and utterly convinced that duty outweighed emotion in all things. She'd raised Franz Joseph to be obedient, conscientious, and dependent on her judgment, and she had no intention of relinquishing control simply because he had married. From the moment Elizabeth arrived in Vienna, Sophie scrutinized her. She found her too emotional, too undisciplined, too fragile for the role of empress. What Elizabeth experienced as sensitivity, Sophie interpreted as weakness. Under the guise of guidance, Sophie took control of Elizabeth's daily life. Her schedule, her education, her public appearances, even her private behaviour were monitored and corrected. Elizabeth was not treated as a partner in rule, but as a decorative asset that required constant supervision. The situation worsened dramatically after Elizabeth had children. Sophie believed Elizabeth was unfit to raise heirs to the empire. As a result, the children were effectively removed from Elizabeth's care and raised under Sophie's authority. Elizabeth was excluded from major decisions regarding their upbringing and, in some cases, from meaningful contact altogether. To understand how devastating this was, imagine giving birth and being told, politely but firmly, that your role is symbolic, that you're not trusted to mother your own children, that they belong to the institution, not to you. This wasn't cruelty in the theatrical sense. It was institutional coldness, and it broke Elizabeth slowly. Franz Joseph, meanwhile, stood by. He loved Elizabeth, but his loyalty to his mother was unshakable. He had been raised to defer to Sophie in all matters, and he continued to do so even after marriage. When conflicts arose between wife and mother, Franz Joseph chose stability over intimacy. Emotionally speaking, Elizabeth did not marry a man who would protect her. She married a man who would never choose her over his mother. In modern terms, it was the equivalent of marrying someone whose parent still controls their decisions, their household and their children, except this parent also happened to run an empire. Elizabeth was isolated, undermined, and powerless. She was empress in title, but in practice she had less autonomy than many women far below her in rank. And this sense of entrapment, of being watched, corrected, and overruled, would shape everything that followed. Then came the loss that would haunt her for the rest of her life. While travelling, against Sophie's wishes, Elizabeth's young daughter fell ill and died. Elizabeth blamed herself relentlessly. The fact that Sophie had opposed the journey only deepened her guilt. In Elizabeth's mind, the tragedy confirmed everything her critics had ever implied, that she was irresponsible, unfit, and dangerous to those she loved. From this point forward, something in her hardened. She withdrew emotionally, not only from the court but increasingly from her remaining children. This withdrawal is often judged harshly in hindsight, but it makes grim psychological sense. Elizabeth learned, through pain, that attachment led to punishment and loss. If you detach, you survive. Her relationship with her son, Crown Prince Rudolph, was complicated and volatile. As Rudolph grew older, Elizabeth recognised in him the same sensitivity and restlessness that had made her a poor fit for court life. She quietly encouraged his intellectual curiosity and liberal political leanings, which directly conflicted with the conservative values of the Habsburg establishment. But this bond was far from harmonious. Elizabeth and Rudolph argued frequently, especially as the expectations placed on him intensified. She wanted him to escape the suffocating rigidity of the system. The system demanded obedience and continuity. Their arguments were not simply mother and son clashing, they were two trapped individuals reacting to the same cage in different ways. At times, Elizabeth pushed Rudolph to resist authority. At other times she recoiled, terrified that rebellion would destroy him the way conformity had destroyed her. She could not decide whether to fight the system through him, or protect him from it by retreating. And this unresolved tension would end in catastrophe. As Elizabeth lost control over her roles as wife and mother, she sought control elsewhere. She found it in her body. Her beauty became legendary, but it was not something she enjoyed. It was something she managed, maintained, and defended with near military discipline. Elizabeth exercised obsessively, often for hours a day, walking enormous distances and following punishing routines that bordered on self-punishment. Her diet was extremely restrictive. She monitored her weight constantly. Her waist reportedly measured around 16 inches, a figure that was celebrated at the time but which today would clearly signal starvation. This was not vanity in the shallow sense. It was a coping mechanism. In a life where her time, her movements, her children, and her identity were controlled by others, her body became the one thing she could dominate absolutely. Every pound lost was a form of defiance. Every physical limit pushed was proof that something, at least, still belonged to her. Her hair became both a symbol and an obsession. It took hours to care for and was treated almost ritualistically. Losing hair distressed her deeply, not merely because of aging, but because it represented loss of control, loss of identity, loss of the one currency she believed still protected her. As she aged, her anxiety around appearance intensified. By her early 30s, Elizabeth refused to be photographed. She avoided public appearances whenever possible, and used veils, fans, and strategic lighting to obscure her face. She understood something that feels strikingly modern, that when a woman's value is tied to beauty, aging feels less like a natural process and more like erasure. And Elizabeth refused to be erased quietly. Her obsession with movement intensified during this period. She walked compulsively, sometimes for hours at a time, covering distances that astonished her companions. Motion became her refuge. As long as she was moving, she didn't have to sit with the stillness of her life. This was not health, it was endurance. And endurance for Elizabeth was the closest thing to freedom she had left. Elizabeth's life at court became increasingly unbearable, and she found her only relief in escape. She travelled whenever she could, often for months at a time, disappearing from Vienna under the guise of diplomatic or leisure trips. She visited England, Greece, and the Italian Riviera, but her greatest affection was reserved for Hungary. Hungary represented freedom. the Hungarian people admired her for more than her beauty. They recognised her as a sympathetic figure who shared their desire for autonomy within the Habsburg Empire. She learned Hungarian fluently, studied their history, and even influenced political matters to support Hungarian interests. In a sense, she became more Hungarian than Austrian, and this defiance did not sit well with the Viennese court. Elizabeth's travel was not mere indulgence, it was a form of rebellion, a refusal to remain under constant scrutiny. She walked for hours every day, rode horses across vast estates, and travelled incognito whenever possible. Motion and distance became her coping mechanisms. If she was moving, she did not have to confront the suffocating presence of the court or the oppressive demands of Sophie. Yet even in escape, she carried the weight of her tragedies. The children she longed to nurture were largely out of reach. Rudolf, her son, was distant, yet her hopes for him remained a tether, a fragile connection to life that was otherwise slipping through her fingers. At times, she acted with surprising boldness. She opposed the court on issues of dress, ceremony, and even protocol, insisting on Hungarian costume for certain public appearances, a symbolic act that emphasized her independence. It was subtle, almost imperceptible rebellion, but for someone like Elizabeth, it was profoundly meaningful. She could not overthrow an empire, but she could assert agency in her own way, and yet freedom came with its own costs. She became increasingly isolated from those around her, even from Franz Joseph. She avoided him at public events whenever possible, seeking spaces where she could be invisible. Her beauty, once celebrated, became a shield. She wanted to be admired, yes, but on her own terms in a world she could control. Travel gave her autonomy, but it could not erase the underlying despair. Wherever she went, the constraints of her life lingered like shadows, reminding her that escape was temporary and survival was measured not by happiness, but by endurance. Elizabeth's life of careful management, subtle defiance, and controlled beauty reached its most devastating turning point in 1889. Her son, Crown Prince Rudolf, died in what is now known as the Mayerling incident, a murder-suicide pact with his young lover. The event shocked Europe and sent the monarchy into crisis. For Elizabeth, it was more than grief. It was annihilation. Rudolf had been the one connection to the possibility of a life different from the one she had endured. She had invested in him not only as a mother but as a confidant, someone who might share her vision of freedom and rebellion. His death destroyed that hope entirely. She was already physically fragile, her beauty and health maintained through extreme discipline and obsession. Emotionally, she was fragile as well, and Rudolf's death shattered the last remnants of her equilibrium. She retreated even further into isolation, avoiding her children, her husband, and the court. She refused public appearances, stopped attending formal ceremonies, and rarely allowed herself to be photographed. Her daily life became a ritual of avoidance. She continued her walking routines, travelled in isolation, and maintained her strict dietary and exercise regimens. But these were no longer exercises of control, they were acts of survival. Her body, once a battleground for autonomy, had become a container for grief. Elizabeth's poetry, which she had written sporadically since childhood, became a record of her despair. Death, loss, and futility dominated her verses. She contemplated mortality with an intensity that was both philosophical and personal, reflecting on the impossibility of freedom in a world determined by expectation and hierarchy. Her husband, Franz Joseph, tried to maintain appearances and uphold the monarchy, but he could not reach her emotionally. Their marriage had never been one of intimacy or mutual understanding, and now it was irreparably fractured by the twin burdens of grief and estrangement. Rudolf's death also intensified Elizabeth's need to escape. She left Vienna even more frequently, often travelling alone or in disguise. These journeys were attempts to outrun sorrow, yet no distance could sever the psychological chains that bound her to the tragedies of her past. Even in motion, she remained tethered to loss and longing. By the end of her life, Elizabeth had become almost unrecognisable to those who had once adored her. The Empress who had captivated Europe with her beauty, charm and intelligence had been transformed by grief, obsession and isolation into a figure of haunting fragility. Her life, which had once promised glamour and admiration, had become a testament to endurance, sorrow and the human cost of a gilded cage. Elizabeth's life of careful escape, silent rebellion and obsessive self-control came to an abrupt and senseless end in 1898. She was travelling incognito in Geneva, attempting once again to move unnoticed through a world that had always scrutinized her every gesture. At the age of 60, she still preferred anonymity to ceremony, freedom to visibility. It was there, on a quiet promenade along the lake, that an anarchist approached her. His attack was swift and indiscriminate. He stabbed Elizabeth with a sharpened file, apparently without fully knowing who he was targeting. The assassin was a stranger, and yet in that instant he delivered a violent punctuation to a life defined by constant tension, grief, and struggle. Remarkably, Elizabeth at first did not realize she had been mortally wounded. She boarded her ship as planned, attempting to continue her journey as if nothing had happened. Only later, in private, did she succumb to her injuries, collapsing into the water's edge of mortality she had long contemplated in poetry and private reflection. The woman who had spent decades fleeing the gaze of courts, photographers, and expectations had been brought down by a force entirely outside her control. A cruel irony that history has never overlooked. Her death marked the end of an era, but also solidified her legend. Portraits, paintings, and later films transformed her into a symbol. The tragic beauty, the misunderstood empress, the woman who loved freedom more than life itself. Yet these cultural representations often obscure the reality. Elizabeth's tragedy was not merely her beauty or her distant nature. It was the relentless imposition of duty, hierarchy, and expectation upon someone who valued autonomy above all else. Elizabeth did not live happily ever after. But in examining her life, we see the complexity, the tragedy, and the extraordinary human spirit behind the image. A woman who, in many ways, remains profoundly relatable, even more than a century after her death. Her story endures, reminding us that history's icons are not simply symbols of glamour, but people who bore their circumstances with courage, suffering, and quiet defiance.